Sutra after Bodhidharma. In China and Japan. Chapter 6. The study of the Sutra after Bodhidharma. In China and Japan. After Bodhidharma, the study of the Lankavatara went on steadily, as is shown in the history of Zen Buddhism. According to tao-hsuan, the author of the sêng, we have under the life of hui-k'ê the following. Therefore, man, and other masters always took along with them the Lankavatara as the book in which spiritual essence is prbpounded. Their discourses and disciplines were everywhere based upon it in accordance with the instructions left by the master. Na and man were disciples of hui-k'ê. Further down in tao-hsuan's biographies we come to the life of Fach, who was a contemporary of tao-hsuan and flourished in the early middle of the sêng, and who was an especial student of the Lankavatara. Here we have a concise history of the study of this sutra after hui-k'ê. Fach, deploring very much that the deep signification of the Lankavatara had been neglected for so long, went around everywhere regardless of the difficulties of traveling in the faraway mountains and over the lonely wastes. He finally came upon the descendants of hui-k'ê, among whom this sutra was being studied a great deal. He put himself under the tutorship of a master and had frequent occasions of spiritual realization. The master then let him leave the company of his fellow students and follow his own way in lecturing on the Lankavatara. He lectured over 30 times in succession. Later he met a monk who had been instructed personally by hui-k'ê in the teaching of the Lankavatara according to the interpretations of the Ekayana school of southern India. Again lectured on it over 100 times. The sutra was originally translated by Gunabhadra of Sung and written down by hui-k'ê. Therefore, wording and sense are in good concord, practice and substance mutually correlated. The entire emphasis of its teaching is placed on prajna, which transcends literary expression. Later, Bodhidharma, the Zen master, propagated this doctrine in the south as well as the north. The gist of which teaching consists in attaining the unattainable, which is to have a right insight into the truth itself by forgetting word and thought. Later, it grew and flourished in the middle part of the country. Hui-k'ê was the first to attain to the essential understanding of it. Those addicted to the literary teaching of Buddhism in way were averse to becoming associated with these spiritual seers. Among the latter there were some who had their minds truly enlightened by penetrating into the very heart of the teaching. As time passed on, the younger generations failed to come to the real understanding of their predecessors. Now we will trace the line of transmission from the beginning, from master to disciple, and show that the Lankavatara has its part in the history of Zen. Tao-hsuan continues. After Bodhidharma there were his two disciples, hui-k'ê and hui-yu. The master Yu, after attaining the truth, was absorbed in his inner life and did not take the trouble to talk about it. The Chan Shi Ws followed by San, Hui, Tuan, Chang, Chen, Yu. They all orally discoursed on the deep meaning of the sutra, and did not leave any literature. After the master K, Shan produced a commentary in 4 fasciculi. Feng, 1 in 5 fas. Ming, 1 in 5 fas. And Hu Ming, 1 in 5 fas. Indirectly following the master K, there were the master Tai Ti, Sung who wrote commentary in 5 fas. Tao Yin, who wrote 1 in 4 fas. Chung, who wrote 1 in 5 fas. An, who wrote 1 in 5 fas. Chung, who wrote 1 in 8 fas. And Tai Ming who wrote 1 in 10 fas. There was another line, independent of the master K, but depending upon. Asanga. S. Mahayana Samgraha. Chen wrote a commentary in 4 FAS. And Shanti the Vinaya Master, 1 in 10 FAS. After Na Kuang, there was Shi the Zen Master, hui-k'ê Wang, and Hung Chi Wbo is said to have been living at Hsi Ming in the capital. After his death the line was broken. Ming the Zen Master was succeeded by Chia, Pao-yu, Pao-ying, and Pao-ying, whose line is still flourishing at present. Chung, since he began to study the Sutras, made the Lankavatara the chief object of his especial study and altogether gave over 200 lectures on it. He has not, however, so far written anything about it. He went about with his lecturing as circumstances directed him, and he had no premeditated plans for his missionary activities. When one gets into the spirit of the teaching, one realizes the oneness of things. But when the letter is adhered to, the truth appears varied. The followers of Chung, however, insisted upon his putting the essence into a kind of writing. Said the Master, the essence is the ultimate reality of existence. When it is expressed by means of language, its finesse is lost. Much more is this the case when it is committed to writing. He, however, could not resist the persistent requests of his disciples. The result appeared as a commentary in 5 fasciculi entitled Hui-k'ê. Private Notes, which is widely circulated at present. Single quote. This detailed story relative to the Lankavatara after hui-k'ê is illuminating in many ways. It not only gives an insight into the historical relation between Zen and the Sutra, but it gives the reason why the relationship exists between them. When the author refers to the specific features of the Lankavatara as consisting in attaining the unattainable, which is beyond the ken of reasoning, he at the same time describes the peculiarities of Zen teaching brought over to China by Bodhidharma. That the school of Dharma was not favorably received by students of Buddhist philosophy, that Hui-yu, who is better known as Tao-yu, kept his mouth closed, knowing that the truth realized in his innermost mind was something beyond the phraseology of ordinary mentalities. That Fa Chung refused to commit his thoughts to writing because by doing so the exquisite coloring of his lively experience vanished. All these statements made by tao-hsuan, who was not yet acquainted with the later growth of Zen Buddhism, delineate with exactitude the characteristic point of Zen. The study of the Lankavatara, as specially related to Zen, was kept up to the time of Fa Chung and tao-hsuan, who were contemporaries, and this was about the time of Hung Zhen, the 5th patriarch of Chinese Zen Buddhism. Judging from these historical facts, we know that the intellectual study and the practical discipline went on side by side, and that there were as yet none of the clear distinctions which later developed distinguishing Zen after Hui Neng, the 6th patriarch, from what preceded him. So far none of all these numerous commentaries on the Lankavatara have been recovered. There is one thing in the foregoing account given by tao-hsuan of the history of the Lankavatara that requires notice. That there was another school in the study of the Sutra than the one transmitted by Dharma and hui-k'ê. This was the school of Yogacara idealism. The line of hui-k'ê belonged to the Ekayana school of southern India, which was also the one resorted to by Dharma himself when he wanted to discourse on the philosophy of Zen Buddhism. To this Ekayana school belong the Avatarasaka and the Sradhotpana as well as the Lankavatara properly interpreted. But as the latter makes mention of the system of the 8 Vijnanas whose central principle is designated as Alayavijnana, it has been used by the Yogacara followers as one of their important authorities. I and the Zen master and other teachers were those among whom the Lankavatara received an interpretation different from that given by Fach and his party. Though Fa Chung is not recorded in any historical work on Zen in our possession at present, he was probably one of the earlier Zen followers. That he was not an ordinary scholar of the Lankavatara is proved by the following incident recorded by tao-hsuan. When Zhuang came back from his long sojourn in India, his influence in the Buddhist world of the day must have been immense. He was perhaps a little too self-confident and somewhat too presumptive when he declared that all the Chinese translations of the Buddhist sutras and sastras prior to him were not exact and reliable, and no discourses or lectures ought to be given on the older texts. When Fa Chung heard of this, he retorted sharply, saying, "You are a Buddhist priest ordained according to the older texts. If you do not allow any further propagation of them, you should first take off the priestly robe and be reordained according to the newer texts. It is only when you listen to this advice of mine that you can go so far as to prohibit the spread of the older translations." This protest from one wandering monk student of the Lankavatara in 4 fasciculi against the most powerful authority of the new translation school, whose reputation and influence must have been almost overwhelming, shows what kind of a man Fach really was. Everything recorded of him reminds one strongly of his Zen training and understanding. The study of the Lankavatara after Fa Chung seems to have declined, especially in connection with Zen Buddhism, and its place was taken by the Vajrachadika, a sutra belonging to the Prajna Paramita group. It is quite interesting to inquire into the circumstances that brought about this change. For one thing, the Lankavatara is a very difficult specimen of literature, and it requires a great deal of scholarship to read and understand it intelligently. Though tao-hsuan remarks that its diction and sense are well in harmony, Su Teng-pei's criticism, which appears in his preface to the Qinshan edition of the Sung dynasty, is more to the point. The Lankavatara is deep and unfathomable in meaning, and in style so terse and antique, that the reader finds it quite difficult to punctuate the sentences properly. Not to say anything about his adequately understanding their ultimate spirit and meaning which go beyond the letter. This was the reason why the sutra grew scarce and it became almost impossible to get hold of a copy. The real difficulty of properly punctuating the Chinese text of the Lankavatara in 4 fasciculi lies not necessarily, as Su F-ung-pei judges, in the classical terseness of style, but rather in its adoption of the Sanskrit style of arranging words, as is remarked by Fa Sang. It was no easy task even for a most competent scholar to find exact Chinese expressions for the original phrases, and frequently he was obliged to follow the Sanskrit grammar. The Chinese translations, therefore, had occasionally to be read, not after their native laws of syntax, but after the Sanskrit. This is what Su Teng-pei really means by terseness of style, and also the reason for Chang Chib-chi's complaint that I was much distressed with the difficulty of reading this sutra. When even scholars of the first grade found the Lankavatara so hard to read, the natural result was to leave it alone on the shelf for the worms to feed on it. Hence its decline as a help to the mastery of Zen. After Fa Sibung, who was contemporary with Hung Zhen, the 5th patriarch of Zen Buddhism in China, the Lankavatara came gradually to be replaced by the Vajrachadika. This does not mean that the former went altogether out of usage, but that the latter came to be thought more of in connection with Zen, especially as Zen grew to be more and more popular and appreciated by the general public outside the cloister. It must, therefore, be said that the 5th patriarch was farsighted enough in this respect. The decline of the Lankavatara was, in effect, inevitable. The statement made by Chang Chi-chi in his preface to the Qinshan edition of the Lankavatara sheds light on the history of the sutra and also on the state of affairs in the Buddhist thought world of his day, and we give the following extract in which the 2 tendencies of Buddhism are referred to. The sutras preached by the Buddha are classified altogether into 12 divisions, which now make up as many as 5,000 fasciculi. While the right law still prevailed, the number of converts was beyond reckoning, who fathomed the depth of the law by merely listening to a half stanza. or even to one phrase of the Buddha's teaching. But as we come to the age of similitude and to these latter days of Buddhism, we are indeed far away from the sage. People at last find themselves being drowned in the letters. The difficulty is like counting the sands on the bottom of the ocean, and they do not know how to get at the one substance which alone is true. This was what caused the appearance of the Fathers, who, directly pointing at the human mind, told us to see here the ultimate ground of all things and thereby to attain Buddhahood. This is known as a special transmission outside the scriptural teaching. If one is endowed with superior talents and an unusual sharpness of mind, a gesture or an utterance will suffice to give one an immediate knowledge of the truth. Therefore, Amun treated the Buddha with the highest degree of irreverence, while Yakusan forbade his followers to even study the sutras, since they were advocates of special transmission. Single quote. Zen is the name given to this branch of Buddhism, which keeps itself away from the Buddha. It is also called the mystical branch, because it does not adhere to the literal meaning of the sutras. It is for this reason that those who blindly follow the steps of Buddha are sure to deride Zen, while those who have no liking for letters are naturally inclined toward the mystical. The followers of the two schools know how to shake the head at each other, but fail to appreciate the fact that they are after all complementary. Is not Zen one of the 6 virtues of perfection? If so, how can it conflict with the teaching of the Buddha? In my view, Zen is the outcome of the Buddha's teaching and the mystical issues from the letters. There is no reason why a man should shun Zen because of the Buddha's teaching, nor need we disregard the letters on account of the mystical teaching. When we realize this, we come nearer to the truth. Jan Chiu asked, "Should I put everything I learn into practice?" Replied Confucius, "Yes, do. So conduct yourself." When Zilu asked the same question of the master, the latter cautioned him, saying, "As long as your parents are still alive, how can you put everything into practice as soon as you learn it?" Yu was backward, so the master urged him to go ahead, while Lu was too pushing, so he was told to be more circumspect. There is nothing cut and dried in Zen teaching, it is always directed at the one-sidedness of human character. The fault of studying scriptural Buddhism lies in the danger of becoming sticklers for the scriptures, the meaning of which they fail to understand rightfully. Ultimate reality is never grasped by such, for them Zen would be salvation. Whereas those who study Zen are too apt to run into the habit of making empty talks and practicing sophistry. They fail to understand the significance of letters. To save them, the study of Buddhist literature or philosophy is to be recommended. It is only when these one-sided views are mutually corrected that there is a perfect appreciation of Buddhist teaching. Of old, when Bodhidharma was here from the West, he handed the mind seal over to the second patriarch, hui-k'ê, and afterwards said, "I have here the Lankavatara in 4 fasciculi which I now pass to you. It contains the essential teaching concerning the mind ground of the Tathagata, by means of which you lead all sentient beings to open their eyes to the truth of Buddhism." According to this we know that Bodhidharma was not one-sided. Both the Buddhist Sutra and Zen were handed over to his disciple, both the mystical and the letters were transmitted. At the time of the 5th patriarch, the Lankavatara was replaced by the Vajrachadika, which was given to the 6th patriarch. When the latter, while peddling kindling wood, heard his customer recite the Vajrachadika, he asked him whence he got the text. He answered, "I come from Mount Wusu, east of Wang Mai in the province of, where Hung Gen the great master advises both monks and laymen to study the Vajrachadika, which will by itself lead him to an insight into the nature of being and thus to the attainment of Buddhahood." Thus the holding of the Vajrachadika started with the 5th patriarch, and this is how the sutra came into vogue and cut short the transmission of the Lankavatara. Single quote. This long passage is quoted from Chang Chih's preface to the Chin Shan edition of the Lankavatara, as it is enlightening in more ways than one. First, we can infer from it that there was a strong antipathy between the philosophers of Buddhism and the Zen followers, each trying to get the upper hand. Second, that the history of Zen Buddhism has been closely connected from the very beginning with the study of the Lankavatara. Third, that the spread of the Vajrachedika was coincident with the rise of Zen under the mastership of Hung Gen. And fourth, that the Lankavatara ceased to be studied as much as before, being replaced by the Vajrachedika, but at the same time showing that the Lankavatara and Zen were most intimately related in spite of the Zen followers' general attitude of aloofness from all the sutras of Buddhist teaching. There is, however, one point in Chang Chi's account which requires revision. He says that the Lankavatara iost its transmission after the adoption by Zen followers of the Vajrachedika. But this is not entirely correct, for not only are allusions to the Lankavatara Sutra found in Masu, but the line of Shen Hsiu seems to have been more partial to the Lankavatara than to the Vajrachedika, as we see in Chang Shuo's stele inscription for Shen Hsiu. As I remarked before, the chief defect in the Lankavatara which prevented its becoming popular was its peculiar style and diction, which is not altogether native Chinese, and which made it difficult even for scholars to understand. On the other hand, the Vajrachedika, like other sutras of the Pryaparamita group, is easy to understand so far as its diction and phraseology go. And besides, it is short in spite of its repetitious style. This advantage over the Lankavatara is sufficient to explain why the Vajrachedika superseded it as a guidebook to the mastery of Zen teaching. While the Lankavatara, according to my judgment, as regards pointing the way to the realization of the inner truth, is nearer the mark, this advantage is easily upset by its unapproachability. And this advantage of the Vajrachedika is in many ways decisive if Zen is to be studied and practiced by a wider circle than scholars and specialists. That the Lankavatara, in spite of its literary shortcomings, kept up its tradition throughout the development and wide propagation of Zen is proved by the existence still of a number of commentaries written in the Ti-ang, Sung, Ming, and Qing, as well as in Japan. What, therefore, we can say of the Lankavatara after the fifth patriarch is that it did not cease to be studied, but was not so much in vogue as before, as for instance at the time of Fach-ung and prior to him. The supersession of the Lankavatam by the Vajrachedika has another reason in the nature of Zen about which I wish to have a word here. Zen has no aversion to book learning necessarily. But in point of fact, Zen can be grasped more readily perhaps by the simple-minded and those who are not stuffed with intellectual accomplishments. As is proved, for instance, in the case of Hui-k'ê, who to all appearance was not so erudite as his rival Shen Hsiu. This practical tendency has produced another tendency to discourage, sometimes to disregard, sometimes to positively slight the study of the sutras. Hence the above remarks of Chang Chi. But here is the lurking place for the two divergent schools of Zen to emerge without being fully conscious of each other's characteristic standpoint. The one clings to the view that Zen is not controlled by the intellect, while the other upholds the fact that Zen is not by nature shy of erudition. The latter tends to be patronized by those whose natural bent is for learning and intellection, while the former is likely to be favored by the more practical-minded. Hui-k'ê belonged to the practical school both by disposition and by education, while Shen Hsiu was a scholar. For this reason Shen Hsiu held fast to the Lankavatara, and Hui-k'ê to the Vajrachedika, while both were being tutored by Hung Gen. For it is not true that Hung Gen was partial to the Vajrachedika. Indeed, for him the one was of as much importance as the other. Seeing that Hung Gen was about to paint the outside wall of his meditation hall with pictures illustrative of the Lankava, Hui-k'ê inscribed his famous poem upon it. What was a unity in the mind of the master, divided itself in the minds of his disciples, each of whom, according to his individuality, asserted one side more forcibly than the other, although not necessarily consciously. When a tendency is thus in the beginning given a strong impetus, it gains momentum, opening up its own course of movement. The Vajrachedika school of Hui-k'ê proved to be more in accord with the Chinese genius and consequently prospered more than the Lankavatara school of Shen-hsiu, though the latter was not entirely replaced by the former. Hui-k'ê was not such an illiterate peddler as is made out by his followers, though he was not so learned and scholarly as Shen-hsiu. But it was more politic for them to contrast their leader in this respect with his rival, who was, indeed, the head of all the monks under Hung Gen not only in learning but in the disciplinary side of Zen as well. By emphasizing this contrast, Hui-k'ê came out to be the greater Zen master, and the absolute aspect of Zen by which it transcends all the intricacies of learning and intellection received more emphasis than it actually needed. The Lankavatara thus finally ceased to be legitimately appreciated by Zen followers of the present day. Some scholars of Buddhism, chiefly modern Japanese, ignorant of the real nature of Zen, yet knowing enough of the historical relation between Hui-k'ê and the Vajrachedika, which was once edited by him with a preface, try to prove that Zen is the outcome of practical training of the mind to gain an insight into its real working. But its absurdity is patent to all serious students of Zen. For the prajna paramita is the result of the intellectual elaboration of the Zen experience, which alone was the object of Hui-k'ê's teaching in connection with all the literary endeavors of scholars. He never took a dislike especially to the Lankavatara. His ignorance was altogether of a different order. There are no records after Fach and after Huineng as to the study by Zen followers of the Lankavatara Sutra, except the commentaries which had been written on it by scholars, and of which we are still in possession. The fact that during the Sung the sutra was much neglected has already been made clear by the preface of Chang Chi-chi and Su Tung Pei to the Qin Shan edition of the sutra. But 4 commentaries of the Sung dynasty are still extant against 2 of the Tianj. One of the Ti-ang commentaries was written by Fa Sang, as was stated previously, and this is a sort of general introduction to the study of the Lankavatara and is the most valuable literature ever written in connection with the sutra. For not only does it give the author's summarized interpretation of the Lankavatara as a whole and of its position in the system of Buddhism, but in it the reader can find Fa Sang's view as a Buddhist philosopher. Quite a few commentaries have been written on this work of Fa Sang's by Japanese scholars. During the Ming dynasty the Lankavatara seems to have been studied much, for we have 7 commentaries that are still in existence written on it during this period. That are still in existence. The Qing dynasty has produced 2, also extant. There are altogether 15 expository writings on the Lankavatara from Chinese scholars, which are still in current circulation, as they are all included in the supplementary part of the Tripitaka compiled by Mr. Tatsuya Nakano, Kyoto, 1905–1912, and one is found in the main body of the Chinese Tripitaka itself. In Japan during the Nara era in the 8th century it was a deed of merit to copy the Lankavatara with other sutras and sastras and to possess extra copies of them. But how earnestly and systematically it was studied is not known. We have many interesting and at the same time illuminating documents of this period, that is, of the first half of the 8th century, in which detailed entries are kept as to the various Buddhist writings that were copied by the official scribes as well as the business side of this pious undertaking which was constantly carried on during those days. Among these old valuable papers are references to the Lankavatara and its commentaries, and the most remarkable thing is that 2 of the commentaries mentioned are ascribed to Bodhidharma himself. How did such a tradition come over to Japan? As far as we know, there are no records in China as to Bodhidharma's authorship of any such writings. If these were still in existence, they would shed much light on the history of Zen Buddhism in China. The first serious study of the sutra was undertaken by a Zen monk called Kukwan Shian, who was also a learned scholar, being the author of a history of Buddhism known as the Genko Shakusho in 30 fasciculi, as was mentioned before. His commentary on the Lankavatara is called the Treatise on the Essence of the Buddha teaching, and consists of 18 fasciculi. His dividing the sutra into 86 sections proves the keenness of his intellectual and analytical acumen. Tokugan Yosen, who published another commentary in 1687, followed Kukwan in the division of the sutra. His commentary is quite an improvement on his predecessors. He mentions, among the Lankavatara commentaries he consulted with, 2 which are not included in the supplementary Tripitaka of Kyoto. I wonder if they are accessible now. A third Japanese work on the sutra is mentioned by Seigaya Mura and Gisho Nakano, who are the authors of the Explanator Y Notes to the Nihon Daizokyo, completed in 1921. TBE title of this Japanese book is Ryoga. Unfortunately, I have not yet been able to see it myself. Lane the same notes 7 works are mentioned written by Japanese scholars as commentaries on F.A. Sung's introduction to the Lankavatara. Most recent Japanese works relative to the Lankavatara are Sogen Yamakami's Japanese rendering of the Lankavatara by Sixionanda, Shoshi Mitsui's concise exposition of the Lankavatara teaching, and Hokei Idzumi's Japanese translation of the Nanjo edition of the Sanskrit original. Each in its way is helpful to the understanding of this neglected Mahayana literature.